The first time I met Clara, she handed me a glass of Sauvignon Blanc and said, "You must be the famous mother-in-law." I remember thinking her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and the way she looked me over felt more like an appraisal than a greeting. My son, Daniel, beamed beside her, clearly smitten and blissfully unaware of the chill that radiated off his fiancée's handshake. "Mom, this is Clara," he said proudly, as if he were introducing me to royalty. I offered a polite nod and a quiet, "Nice to meet you," unsure whether the flutter in my chest was nerves or instinct. If you have a similar story about betrayal from the people you least expect, tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Clara was tall, poised, and dressed like a woman who had memorized every page of a lifestyle magazine. She had a way of tilting her head when I spoke, like she was waiting to catch me saying something quaint or embarrassing. That first dinner at their downtown apartment had been all linen napkins and avocado mousse, and I'd left with the vague sense I'd been interviewed rather than welcomed. I didn't dislike her then, not exactly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being categorized. Not as Daniel's mother, not as a person, but as something she needed to manage. I had spent 27 years as a high school English teacher, a fact Clara seemed to absorb with the enthusiasm of someone learning I collected old buttons. "That must be rewarding," she said, drawing out the word like it had quotation marks. She worked in finance, wealth management to be precise, and was fond of throwing around terms like aggressive portfolios and capital fluidity with the smug ease of someone who thought interest rates were a personality trait. At first I tried to bridge the distance with polite questions, but I quickly learned that Clara didn't ask questions back. She didn't need to. She already had the answers she wanted about me. Daniel, for his part, looked happier than I'd seen him in years, so I smiled and nodded and tucked away the uncomfortable moments. It was easier to ignore the micro-slights than to risk dampening his joy. I told myself that maybe I was being sensitive, maybe Clara's confidence just felt abrasive because I wasn't used to it. After all, Daniel had brought home girlfriends before, but none who made him talk about marriage like it was a business merger. Still, there was a quiet place in the back of my mind that whispered, "She doesn't respect you, and one day it's going to matter." The wedding was held in a converted winery 2 hours outside the city, the kind of place where every exposed beam had been sanded and stained to Instagram perfection. I arrived early, as instructed, and was immediately ushered into the bridal suite by a coordinator wearing a headset. Clara sat in a velvet chair, draped in a silk robe, surrounded by bridesmaids with identical waves in their hair and identical flutes of champagne in their hands. "Ah, there she is," Clara said as if she'd summoned me. "Everyone, this is Daniel's mom, Emma." The way she said it, I felt like an afterthought to a much grander narrative. I smiled and said hello, then quietly backed out of the room, feeling more like hired help than family. The ceremony itself was flawless, or at least that's what everyone said afterward. Clara's vows were poetic, choreographed to perfection, while Daniel looked on like a man who had won a prize he never thought he'd deserve. I kept my thoughts to myself and clapped when I was supposed to, toasted when I was told, and tried to enjoy the evening for Daniel's sake. But I should have known Clara wasn't finished with me. It happened during the reception, just after the second round of champagne had been poured, and people started drifting away from their assigned tables. Clara approached with a man in tow, tall, square-jawed, and wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. "Mom," she said sweetly, looping her arm through mine, "I want you to meet my boss, Mr. Kellerman." I smiled and extended my hand, already bracing for whatever professional polish Clara had prepared to smear over the encounter. "This is Emma," Clara said, keeping her voice light. "She's between jobs right now." The words hung in the air like a gnat no one wanted to swat. Then she added with a laugh that wasn't really a laugh, "Well, I guess you could say she's retired, sort of. It's been, a few years now? Honestly, she's enjoying the slow life. You know how it is." I blinked once, then twice, unsure whether I'd heard her correctly. Mr. Kellerman offered a polite nod, clearly uncomfortable. Clara just smiled, wide and unbothered, as if she'd just paid me a compliment. It took a moment for the sting to register, and when it did, it came with heat behind my eyes and a sharp pulse in my temples. Between jobs. As if I'd been laid off from a lemonade stand. As if the years I'd spent shaping young minds, advocating for struggling students, mentoring new teachers, none of it counted for anything anymore. I'd retired early to care for my own mother through a long illness, something Clara never once asked about. I hadn't been between jobs. I'd made a choice, one rooted in love and sacrifice, but Clara didn't care about that. What mattered to her was image. She wanted Mr. Kellerman to see her as a woman who had risen above a humble family, someone who had outgrown the small lives around her. And in that moment, I understood exactly what she thought I was, a blemish to be glossed over, a non-threat, an expendable piece in her polished little game. But Clara had miscalculated one very important thing. I wasn't done yet. I excused myself with the kind of smile I used to give difficult parents during parent-teacher conferences. It said everything and nothing at once. Mr. Kellerman looked relieved when I stepped away, probably glad to avoid whatever awkwardness Clara's comment had summoned. I made my way out to the veranda, where the cool night air helped steady my breathing. From there, I could see the reception hall lit up like a dream, laughter and music spilling out in waves. I watched Clara laugh with a group of people near the bar, tossing her hair back as if the world were weightless. For a moment, I envied her, not her confidence, but her ability to dismiss the people she didn't think mattered. And then I remembered something my mother used to say: "The cruel are always counting on your silence." I pulled out my phone and typed a few names into the search bar. I had taught for nearly 3 decades. Hundreds of students, many of whom had gone on to do incredible things. Some of them owed me nothing, but a few owed me everything. Inside the reception, Clara's laughter rang out again, louder this time, tinged with a kind of triumph. She believed she had put me in my place, safely tucked into a harmless narrative that served her ambition. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that I had once helped a shy, uncertain teenager named James Kellerman pass his senior year with a last-minute essay rewrite and a promise to never give up on himself. That same boy had sent me a Christmas card every year for nearly a decade, until his new job and new life pulled him away. And now he was Clara's boss. I stared at my phone screen, heart thudding in my chest as the pieces clicked together. I scrolled through my emails until I found it, 3 years ago, a message from James Kellerman thanking me for believing in him. I tapped out a reply and pressed send before I could think twice. Let the games begin. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. I didn't expect a reply that night, but it came before I finished my second glass of wine. James's name flashed on my screen with a subject line that simply read, "Is it really you?" I opened the message and found a cascade of warmth, surprise, and something like reverence tucked between the lines. He remembered everything: the makeup essay on Baldwin, the after-school sessions, the pep talks I'd given him before his scholarship interview. "You changed my life, Miss Cartwright," he wrote, still using my old name, even though I'd told every student to call me Emma after graduation. "I wouldn't be where I am without you." I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart swelling with something Clara could never understand. Influence isn't always loud or lucrative, but it lasts longer than she thinks. James ended his message with an invitation to coffee before he flew back to New York. He signed off with gratitude, not knowing he'd just handed me the sharpest tool I could possibly use. I returned to the reception with a calm smile, the kind that comes from knowing the next move before anyone else. Clara didn't notice me come back in. She was too busy posing for photos with her bridesmaids by the dessert table. Daniel saw me, though, and his face softened when he caught my eye. He mouthed, "You okay?" And I nodded, because yes, now I was. I spent the rest of the evening quietly watching, observing the way Clara worked the room like it was a client mixer, not a celebration of love. She clinked glasses with men twice her age, flirted with waiters for faster service, and made sure her laughter could be heard from every corner of the hall. The only time she came near me again was to whisper, "Try not to make a scene, okay?" before sweeping off towards someone wearing a Rolex. I smiled at her back and said nothing, letting her believe I'd accepted my place in her carefully curated hierarchy. But I wasn't going to make a scene. Not tonight. No, my scene would come later, and it would be quieter, colder, and far more surgical. The coffee shop James chose was tucked behind a florist's near the old university campus, the kind of place with too many plants and mismatched mugs. He stood when I walked in, his smile stretching wide as he opened his arms. "Ms. Cartwright," he said, and I laughed as I hugged him, instantly transported back to the teacher's lounge and late-night grading. "James," I said, stepping back to take him in. He'd grown into his frame, filled out in that quiet, unassuming way that made his confidence feel earned, not worn like a costume. We ordered drinks and found a corner table, and for the next 20 minutes we talked like no time had passed. He told me about the firm, how he'd taken over as a regional director last year, how he'd built his team carefully, hiring people who cared about integrity and long-term impact. I listened, genuinely proud, until he leaned in and said, "Now tell me what happened at that wedding." I hesitated, then told him everything. Clara's introduction, her words, the implication, the smile that cut. And when I finished, James leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised, then softly whistled. "That's not how she talks about you at the office," he said after a long pause. I blinked. "She talks about me at the office?" James gave a short laugh. "Oh yeah, constantly. Always dropping your name like a sandbag when she wants to seem grounded. My future mother-in-law taught English for decades. She's so wise, so patient. You were practically her credibility token." I felt something cold uncoil in my chest, the kind of calculated manipulation that made my skin crawl. "So to you, I'm a wise mentor figure," I said slowly. "But to your face, I'm an unemployed loser." James's smile vanished. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said. "I had no idea she said that to you. That's not just unprofessional. It's cruel." And then he leaned forward again, his voice quieter but firm. "What would you like me to do?" The question caught me off guard because I hadn't expected that kind of power to be handed to me so plainly. I took a slow breath, staring into my lukewarm latte, and weighed the temptation against what I actually wanted. "Nothing yet," I said finally. "But I'd like you to keep an open mind when she brings up her next big pitch." James nodded, clearly understanding there was more to come. "In the meantime," I added, "don't tell her we met." That part was important, and he agreed without hesitation. Clara thrived in certainty, in control. The idea that something might be happening beyond her view would shake her in ways she wouldn't know how to name. I left the coffee shop that day, not with a plan, but with a pulse of clarity. I didn't want revenge, not really. I wanted exposure. I wanted her to stand in the same spotlight she'd so eagerly dragged me into. Only this time, she wouldn't be in charge of the script. The opportunity came 3 weeks later when Clara posted a photo on LinkedIn of herself in a boardroom, captioned, "Excited to lead our next client strategy session with Mr. Kellerman and his team." James forwarded it to me with the message, "Didn't invite herself, I promise." I replied with a simple, "Of course not. Let me know when." The meeting was set for the following Thursday, and James made sure it was an open session, meaning staff from across the region could attend. I wasn't on the official invite list, and Clara never saw it coming. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a navy blouse and slacks, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed revenge. A few people recognized me. I'd done guest lectures before at their mentorship program, and the whispers started before the meeting even began. Clara walked in 5 minutes late, flanked by 2 assistants, laughing about something on her phone. Her eyes skimmed the room and then locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow. "Emma?" she said slowly, walking toward me like I was an illusion she wasn't quite ready to believe. "What are you doing here?" I smiled, the kind of smile that offered nothing but a promise. "Oh, I'm just here to observe," I said calmly. "James invited me. Didn't he tell you?" Clara's face twitched. A microscopic movement, but I caught it. "I must have missed that," she said through tight lips. "Well, welcome, I guess." She turned away too quickly, barking something to her assistant as she moved toward the head of the table. I sat near the back, silent and invisible, but every time Clara looked up, she saw me watching. The presentation began with Clara standing confidently at the front, her blazer buttoned tight, and her tone clipped and practiced. She introduced the project like it was already hers, her voice honeyed with authority, tossing around phrases like target synergies and innovative realignment as if they meant something. I watched James closely, noting how he kept his expression neutral, offering nods when required but not giving her the enthusiastic feedback she clearly craved. Clara barely looked my way now, though I could feel her awareness of me like a tremor under the floor. She clicked through slide after slide, outlining a strategy that was more cosmetic than functional, polished but hollow. James let her talk for nearly 20 minutes before he raised a single finger and asked, "How would this scale across regional branches without centralizing the client data?" She blinked, then stammered something about adaptive metrics and data integrity pipelines, none of which addressed the actual question. James nodded, not unkindly, but scribbled something on the notepad in front of him. I noticed several other attendees glance at one another, their polite masks starting to slip. By the time Clara reached her final slide, the applause was light, more out of obligation than genuine approval. "Thank you, Clara," James said, rising to his feet with the easy authority of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. "Before we wrap up, I'd like to open the floor for feedback, and we're honored to have someone with us today who knows more about long-term strategy and human development than most of us combined." Clara's head whipped around so fast I thought she might sprain something. I smiled calmly, standing only when James extended a hand in my direction. "Emma Cartwright," he continued, "was my high school English teacher and remains one of the smartest mentors I've ever had." A few people clapped, and I gave a small, gracious nod before speaking. "I won't take much of your time," I said, "but I do want to say this. Clarity of purpose should always outweigh performance polish." The room went still, listening more closely than they had during any of Clara's slides. Clients don't care how many buzzwords you know. They care about whether you understand what they need before they do. Clara folded her arms across her chest, expression tight. "Also," I added gently, "respect goes further in leadership than bravado." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was contemplative, like the air had been reset. I thanked them for their time and sat down, fully aware that I'd just stolen the spotlight Clara had worked so hard to own. James transitioned the meeting into Q&A, and though several people asked her questions, they sounded more like evaluations than curiosity. Clara answered everything with her usual composed edge, but the cracks in her armor were visible now. She stumbled over a stat she normally would have memorized, misquoted a client metric, and once referred to me as Mrs. Cartwright before correcting herself. I never corrected her. I didn't need to. When the meeting ended, James closed his laptop and said, quote, "Great work today, everyone. We'll follow up with evaluations next week." Clara lingered by the door, trying to gather her notes with hands that trembled just slightly. As the room emptied, she made her way toward me with a strained smile. "You didn't tell me you knew James," she said in a low voice, half accusation, half question. "You didn't ask," I replied simply. Outside the building, the city was buzzing with early afternoon energy, street vendors shouting, tires hissing, the scent of roasted nuts drifting on the wind. I stood at the corner, watching Clara exit the revolving door a few minutes after me, her phone pressed to her ear as she muttered something urgent. I didn't follow her, didn't need to. The ripple had already started. Over the next few days, I received 3 LinkedIn connection requests from people who had been in that meeting, each accompanied by polite messages of admiration. One woman named Priya thanked me for cutting through the corporate fog and said it had reminded her why she went into business in the first place. I didn't respond right away, choosing instead to observe the changes from a distance. Daniel called that Friday evening, his voice cheerful, talking about their honeymoon plans and asking if I could check on their plants while they were away. I agreed without hesitation, even though the idea of walking into their shared apartment made something in my chest twist. "Clara says you two ran into each other at her office," he said casually. "Small world, huh?" "Very small," I replied. It was enlightening. The following Monday, I stopped by their apartment with a spare key Daniel had given me last Christmas, back when things felt simpler. The space was spotless, clinical even, like something out of a lifestyle blog rather than a home. I watered the snake plant by the balcony and fed the fish in the minimalist glass bowl by the window. On the way out, I noticed a thick stack of business cards on the counter, all branded with Clara's name and title. Executive Strategy Lead, Kellerman Financial. I picked one up, flipping it over to find a handwritten quote on the back. Perception is reality. It was in her handwriting, precise, slanted, aggressive. I tucked it back under the stack and left without another glance. That night, I sat on my porch with my tea and wondered when perception had become more valuable than character. Somewhere along the way, Clara had convinced herself that the only truth that mattered was the one she could control. But truth doesn't bend forever. Eventually, it snaps. The first real crack came a week later when James forwarded me an internal memo sent to all department leads. It announced a restructuring of the strategic leadership team, citing a need for more collaborative and ethically aligned voices at the decision-making table. Clara's name was notably absent from the new task force list. Attached was a private note from James. She's not demoted yet, but the review committee is meeting next quarter, and her performance will be under real scrutiny this time. I didn't smile, but I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction exactly, but alignment. Clara had tried to define me in front of her boss, and now her own definition was unraveling. I sent James a short reply, thanking him for his transparency. "Let it unfold naturally," I wrote. "Sometimes the best rebuttal is simply being witnessed." The next day, I got an email from a journalist I hadn't heard from in years. A former student turned editorial writer for a major publication. "I heard you stood up in a boardroom and delivered a masterclass," she wrote. "Want to talk about it?" I didn't say yes right away because I didn't want this to become about ego. But something about the phrase, "delivered a masterclass," stuck with me, especially because it hadn't come from me. Clara had spent months painting herself as the only professional in Daniel's life, the only one with real goals, real purpose. And she'd done it by diminishing others, starting with me. The article, when it finally ran, was a piece about quiet influence, featuring stories of teachers who'd gone on to shape industries in ways no one saw coming. I was one of 3 women profiled, and though my name was familiar only to a handful of people in Clara's world, the article was shared widely. Clara didn't mention it, but I saw her like on the post. A week later, she blocked me on Instagram. I didn't mind. Influence doesn't need to be acknowledged to be real. Sometimes the most important work happens in silence, long after the performance is over. Daniel didn't see the article until a coworker mentioned it over lunch, asking if he was related to the Emma Cartwright featured in the piece. He texted me a screenshot with a string of exclamation points and a simple, "This is you?" I waited before responding, unsure how much Clara had already spun in her favor. "Yes," I finally wrote. It was a surprise for me too. An old student reached out. He called that evening, voice bubbling with pride, and asked why I hadn't told him about it sooner. I told him the truth, that it felt more like closure than celebration, a way of reclaiming my place in a story I hadn't written. Clara was quiet in the background, and though she didn't speak directly to me, I could hear the tension between them in the silence. Daniel said he wanted us all to have dinner next week. A fresh start, he called it. I agreed, because sometimes you have to step into the lion's den to remind the lion that you're not afraid. Besides, if Clara wanted to rebuild the narrative, I wanted to see what version she'd attempt next, and I wasn't about to let her do it without a witness. We met at a small Italian place halfway between their apartment and my neighborhood, one of those cozy places with candlelight and menus handwritten on blackboards. Daniel greeted me with a warm hug, pulling out my chair like he used to when he was little, and wanted to impress me on Mother's Day. Clara arrived 2 minutes later, dressed in a beige blazer that looked expensive but safe, like she was trying to seem inoffensive. "Emma," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's good to see you." I returned the sentiment, just as warmly, letting the quiet settle over the table like a fresh linen napkin. We ordered wine, talked about traffic, and let the awkwardness hum beneath our words like a silent metronome. Daniel tried his best to stitch the evening together with anecdotes about work and wedding gifts, but the tension was stitched into the seams of every exchange. Clara finally broached the subject by saying, "That article was unexpected." I nodded, waiting. "I didn't realize you had such a following." "I don't," I replied calmly, setting down my glass. "I just had students who remembered where they came from." Clara tilted her head, considering the weight of that sentence, then offered a small shrug. Still, it was impressive. I thanked her, but I didn't soften. Her tone wasn't admiration, it was assessment. Daniel, ever the peacemaker, smiled like he'd just averted a disaster. "I think it's amazing," he said, reaching for his fork. "I mean, you taught James Kellerman? That's wild!" Clara didn't flinch, but her posture stiffened just slightly, as if the chair had grown less comfortable. I wondered if she remembered that James had introduced me as his mentor in front of half her office. I wondered if it bothered her that I hadn't needed to name-drop anyone. By dessert, Clara had shifted tactics, complimenting my earrings and asking about my garden like she genuinely cared. I answered politely, then excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to breathe. In the mirror, I saw a woman who didn't look like anyone's afterthought. My hair had gone fully silver last year, and I'd stopped trying to hide it. Something about that decision had made me feel more powerful. I washed my hands slowly, letting the cool water center me, then returned to the table to find Daniel laughing and Clara watching him like a cat watches a bird it already caught. She looked up as I approached and said, "I was just telling Daniel about the charity board I'm joining. It's for young professional women in finance. I think it's important to give back." I nodded, not challenging her, because her tells were louder when she thought she was leading. "Giving back is always a good thing," I said, "especially when you've had so much help along the way." Clara's smile flickered, but she held it steady. Daniel didn't catch the undercurrent, or maybe he didn't want to. "Maybe you could speak at one of their events," Clara added quickly. "It would look great for the group to have someone seasoned." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Seasoned is just a polite word for someone who doesn't need to prove herself anymore." She blinked once, the only indication that she hadn't expected me to answer so directly. "Well," she said, turning her attention back to her drink, "that's one way to see it." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, probably wondering how two compliments turned into a duel. I let the silence bloom, and then changed the subject for his sake, asking about their honeymoon dates. The rest of the dinner passed without incident, but Clara didn't speak again unless spoken to. As we said our goodbyes, Daniel hugged me twice, whispering, "Thanks for coming. It really meant a lot." Clara offered a handshake, her palm cool and her grip loose. I took it without hesitation, because I wanted her to feel the absence of warmth. As I walked to my car, I realized she hadn't won this round. She'd simply run out of moves. 2 days later, James emailed again, asking if I would consider consulting on a new mentorship initiative he was launching at the firm. "It's internal," he explained, "but I think you could help shape the entire program. We need people who understand how to develop talent, not just promote it." I asked what it would entail, and he sent over a draft outline, along with a stipend offer that surprised me. "I know you're not in it for the money," he wrote, "but I believe people should be compensated for wisdom, not just labor." I said yes, not because of Clara or the firm or even the money, but because it mattered. Teaching was never about the paycheck. It was about legacy. And I finally understood that the classroom hadn't been the end of my story. It was just the prologue. Clara wouldn't see this as a victory. But then again, she wasn't invited to this chapter. At our first internal strategy meeting, I was introduced to the broader leadership team as a senior development consultant. Clara wasn't present. James explained she'd been temporarily reassigned to a different project while things realign. No one said her name, but her absence was a presence all its own. I reviewed the mentorship plan, offered feedback, and scheduled follow-up sessions with 3 department heads. By the end of the day, I had received 4 thank you emails and 1 tentative invitation to speak at an external panel. I forwarded the invite to James with a note, "Only if Clara's not hosting." He replied with a winking emoji and a promise. I smiled as I shut my laptop, the city lights blooming across my window like quiet applause. It wasn't revenge, it was restoration. By the time Clara returned to the main strategy team, her posture had changed. The sharpness in her gait was still there, but her voice had lost some of its polish, as if she was holding back just enough to avoid drawing attention. Word had quietly spread about the mentorship initiative, and though I never mentioned her, people noticed the timing. She passed me once in the hallway without speaking, her expression unreadable, but her eyes darted toward the badge clipped to my lapel, senior consultant. I didn't chase her or seek her out. There was no need. Clara was now operating in a space she hadn't prepared for, one where influence wasn't measured in titles or threads per inch. She attended meetings but rarely led them, and when she spoke, her suggestions were careful, almost deferential. I watched her navigate the room like someone who had lost her map. She still smiled, still played the part, but the edges of her certainty had begun to fray. And for the first time since the wedding, Clara looked like someone who knew she was being watched, not by me, but by everyone. Daniel, blissfully unaware of the shifting dynamic at his wife's workplace, continued to assume that everything was fine. He brought me lemon scones one Saturday morning, a peace offering after a canceled brunch the week before. "Clara's been swamped," he said, sipping coffee on my porch, legs stretched out like a boy home from summer camp. "They've got her on something big again. Sounds like they're prepping her for a new client portfolio." I didn't comment, just nodded and passed him a napkin. There was no benefit in disrupting his version of peace unless it became necessary. Letting Daniel figure things out on his own was the only way he'd believe it. If I warned him now, he'd defend her, not because he didn't see the cracks, but because he didn't want to admit they were there. We talked about his upcoming hiking trip, about the stray cat that had been showing up near their building, and about my neighbor's disastrous attempt to install solar panels. It was a good morning, calm and warm, and I let him leave without pressing too hard. But as he hugged me goodbye, I noticed the way his shoulders sagged, the weight of something he hadn't said. A week later, Clara sent me an email with no subject line. It read simply, "Are you free for coffee sometime this week? Just us." I stared at the message for a long time, uncertain what version of Clara would be sitting across from me if I agreed. I didn't reply right away. I let the request sit for 2 days before responding with a time and place, the same cafe where I'd met James. When I arrived, she was already there, back straight, stirring her coffee even though it was clearly black. She looked tired, the kind of tired that no concealer could fully hide. "Thanks for coming," she said, voice low and controlled. I thought it might be time we actually spoke. I sat down without a word, waiting for her to begin, because whatever this was, it wasn't casual. "I underestimated you," Clara said finally, her fingers tightening around her mug. "And I think I need to understand why that was such a mistake." I didn't answer her right away, not out of malice, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of her own words. "You didn't just underestimate me," I said eventually. "You dismissed me. That's different." She nodded slowly, not denying it, but not apologizing either. "I'm used to being the one who defines the room," she said. "But you walked in and changed the temperature without even trying." That made me smile, not because it was a compliment, but because it was finally true. "And that frightened you?" I asked. Clara's lips curved into something small and weary. "It disrupted me," she admitted. "I built everything on the belief that if I controlled the narrative, I'd control the outcome." "That's not how people work," I replied gently. "People remember how you make them feel, not how you brand yourself." Clara stared down at her coffee as if hoping it would offer a different ending. "I don't want to lose my position," she said, almost too quietly. "I've worked so hard to get here." For a brief moment, I saw her not as Daniel's arrogant bride, or the woman who called me a loser in front of her boss, but as a girl who had clawed her way to the top and now feared she'd be thrown off the edge. "Then change the way you lead," I said. "You don't have to destroy to ascend." Clara looked at me like the idea had never occurred to her. "You're not trying to get me fired?" she asked, confusion flickering across her face. "If I wanted that," I said calmly, "you wouldn't be sitting here." We finished our coffee in silence, the tension no longer sharp, but suspended like a string between us. When we stood to leave, Clara reached out. Not for a handshake, but for a moment of acknowledgement. "I'm not ready to call this a truce," she said. "But I don't want to be your enemy anymore." I nodded. "Then don't be." She walked away with a little less certainty in her step. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Not all growth comes from triumph. Some of it starts in surrender. I returned to my car, sat behind the wheel, and let myself exhale. Something had shifted, not just in Clara, but in me. I no longer needed to win. I'd already reclaimed what she tried to erase. That night, I got a text from Daniel. "Clara said you two had coffee." She didn't say much, just that it was honest. "I think that's good." I wrote back, "Honesty is always a good place to start." He responded with a heart emoji. then sent a photo of the stray cat curled up on their welcome mat. "She won't leave," he added. "Clara says we should just adopt her." I smiled at the screen, amused by the quiet symbolism of it all. A creature showing up uninvited, making itself at home, refusing to be ignored. Some things in life are like that. They arrive in your life, unwanted at first, inconvenient, messy, but if you stop trying to shoo them away, sometimes they end up changing everything. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. The mentorship program launched in full that fall, complete with weekly sessions, guest panels, and one-on-one coaching hours. My role was intentionally understated. I facilitated, guided, asked the questions others were too eager to skip past. Clara attended the first 3 sessions without comment, sitting toward the back, scribbling in her notebook like she was auditing a college course she didn't want to take. She never spoke unless directly addressed, but I noticed she stayed after each session, lingering just long enough to hear what people said once the formal part ended. James had given her space, which I appreciated. The goal was growth, not punishment. Still, it wasn't lost on me that she was observing something she'd once thought beneath her. The younger associates gravitated toward me, asking for career advice, leadership tips, and sometimes just someone to listen. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen for what I offered rather than who I wasn't. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like a teacher again, just without the red pens and late-night grading. Daniel brought the cat over one afternoon while Clara was stuck in a client meeting, announcing that her name was officially Monday, because she's difficult and unpredictable, but somehow still comforting, he said, chuckling as Monday leapt onto my windowsill like she owned the place. I wasn't a cat person, but there was something disarming about the little creature, all fur and eyes, with a low, insistent purr that didn't take no for an answer. "Clara says she's good luck," Daniel added, scratching behind the cat's ears. I raised an eyebrow at that. Clara, believing in luck, was like seeing a wolf believe in fairy tales. "She's changed," Daniel said quietly, like he was afraid to say it too loud in case it shattered. "Not completely, but she's trying. I think she's realizing there's more to life than promotion boards and performance metrics." I didn't answer right away, watching Monday bat at the curtain tie like it had personally offended her. "Trying is a good start," I said. "But change is something you prove, not just say." That weekend, I received a call from an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, it was Clara's mother. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," she said, her voice warm but cautious, like she was feeling out the distance between us. Clara told me a little about what happened at the wedding and after. I didn't interrupt, just let her speak, because the fact she'd reached out at all meant something was shifting beneath the surface. "I wanted to say thank you," she continued, "not just for handling things with grace, but for not torching her when you could have." Her honesty was surprising and oddly comforting. "Clara's always been driven," she added, "but she's never had someone hold up a mirror like that." We talked for 20 minutes, mostly about nothing, and by the end I realized how little Clara had ever mentioned her family to me. She'd built her life on distance, on clean slates and sharper edges. And maybe, just maybe, someone finally handed her a soft one. The article kept circulating long after I stopped checking its metrics, popping up in blogs, reposts, and corporate newsletters. A publishing contact reached out about expanding the piece into a book, a blend of memoir and professional development. "You have a voice," she wrote. "And people are ready to hear it." I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. I wasn't sure if the world needed another book about leadership, but maybe it needed a story about dignity, about quiet strength, about showing up even when someone tries to make you small. Clara never mentioned the article again, but at one of the mentorship sessions, she stayed behind while others filtered out. "I read it," she said simply. I looked up, waiting. "You're a better writer than I thought." It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it wasn't sarcasm either. It felt like the closest she could get to humility without losing her balance. James invited me to co-host an upcoming leadership retreat in the mountains, a 3-day event aimed at resetting the firm's core values. "You don't have to say yes," he said. "But I think it would mean something to the team." I hesitated at first, unsure whether I wanted to blur the line between consultant and torchbearer. But something told me this wasn't about visibility. It was about anchoring something new. I said yes, on the condition that the retreat include breakout sessions on ethics, legacy, and emotional intelligence. "Make it less about climbing," I told him, "and more about what you're building once you're up there." Clara was on the attendee list, and part of me wondered how she'd take it. Whether she'd see it as another platform I'd taken from her or a stage she'd never known existed. Either way, I wasn't there to impress her. I was there to protect the space that should have always existed, where substance outshines show. The retreat was held in a modern lodge surrounded by pine and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes people listen better. The sessions were split between structured dialogue and open reflection, and by the second day, people stopped performing and started telling the truth. One young analyst broke down during a session about burnout, saying she'd never felt safe admitting she wasn't okay. Clara, to her credit, sat beside the girl for the entire break afterward, offering tissues and saying nothing performative. That night, a fire crackled in the lodge's central hearth, and people lingered longer, trading stories instead of business cards. I stood by the window, tea in hand, when Clara approached. "You were right," she said without preamble. "About what?" I asked. "About people remembering how you make them feel." She looked tired, not in a defeated way, but in the way people do when they finally stopped running. "I think I've been trying to be impressive for so long, I forgot how to be good." I didn't respond, just reached for her hand. She let me hold it for a moment before stepping away into the warmth of the firelight. On the final morning, we all gathered for a closing circle. No podiums, no presentations, just a shared space. James thanked everyone, then handed the last words to me. I spoke about courage, not as a weapon, but as a posture, something quiet, steady, and earned. I told them that legacy isn't built in moments of glory, but in how we respond when no one's watching. I didn't name names or call back past moments. I just let the message hang in the air like morning mist. Clara sat in the circle, hands folded, nodding softly at the end. She didn't speak, but her silence felt different this time, not withholding, but present. As we packed up, she handed me a card. "You don't need to read it now," she said. I didn't. I waited until I was home, in my kitchen, with Monday curled against my leg and the kettle humming on the stove. And when I opened the envelope, the only words inside were, "Thank you for seeing who I could be." After the retreat, something settled between Clara and me. Not friendship exactly, but something quieter, sturdier. We didn't start calling each other for lunch dates or swapping family recipes, but when our paths crossed, the tension had dissolved. At the office, she'd nod in passing and sometimes linger long enough to ask thoughtful questions during sessions. Daniel noticed the shift too, mentioning one night that Clara seemed lighter somehow, though he couldn't quite name why. I just smiled and told him growth is rarely loud. It rustles, it doesn't roar. Monday, the cat had officially claimed a permanent spot on their couch, and Daniel sent me photos weekly of her lounging like she paid rent. "She knocked over Clara's espresso machine last night," he texted, and Clara didn't even yell. "Who is this woman?" I laughed out loud, wondering if Monday understood the strange truths she had helped broker. Sometimes, change came on four paws with a tendency to knock over expensive things. And sometimes, people like Clara needed a little chaos to learn how to soften. The book offer sat in my inbox for another 2 weeks before I finally opened the proposal. The editor wanted something part memoir, part leadership guide, leaning into the unexpected intersections of teaching and corporate influence. It wasn't the kind of thing I'd ever imagined doing. I was used to scribbling comments in the margins of essays, not seeing my name on cover mock-ups. Still, the thought of putting everything I'd learned into something tangible, something that outlived a single meeting or retreat, had its appeal. I printed the outline, made a fresh pot of tea, and sat at the kitchen table with Monday curled on the chair beside me. For hours, I jotted notes, stories, phrases I'd said 100 times in classrooms and boardrooms without realizing their value. It felt good, in a strange way, to chronicle the wisdom no one had asked for until now. I decided to call it the quiet seat at the table, a nod to the place people often tried to push me toward, not realizing how clearly you could see everything from there. The title felt right, like closure and an invitation all at once. I emailed the editor back before I could overthink it and said, "Let's do it." Word spread quickly, faster than I expected, and within a month, I had 3 interview requests. One from a major business podcast that Clara used to quote religiously. When the producer reached out, she said, "We'd love to hear about your approach to leadership. It's so different from the usual noise." I agreed to the interview, not out of vanity, but because if I'd been given this chance 10 years earlier, maybe I could have saved myself from doubting my own voice so long. The morning of the recording, I wore a navy blouse and the pearl earrings Daniel had given me on my retirement day. I didn't talk about Clara or the wedding directly, but I mentioned the idea of being underestimated and how often it leads to reinvention. I spoke about mentorship, about legacy, about not needing to raise your voice to raise your impact. After it aired, I got messages from former students, some now teachers themselves, who said the episode made them cry. One woman wrote, "You reminded me that quiet doesn't mean small. Thank you." I didn't reply to all of them, but I read every single word. Each message felt like a piece of something I hadn't realized I'd lost, and just now remembered how to claim. Clara never mentioned the podcast, but a week after it aired, I noticed she'd reshared it on her professional feed with the caption, "The kind of leadership we should be paying more attention to." It was the only thing she posted that week. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman who had once introduced me as an unemployed loser with the one now quoting my work. People are complicated, I reminded myself. We are rarely just one version of ourselves forever. At the next mentorship session, Clara spoke up for the first time, sharing an anecdote about being too controlling on a past project and how it backfired. She didn't name names, didn't cry, didn't perform vulnerability. She simply told the truth. It landed with a kind of silence I recognized well, the kind that means people are listening deeply. Afterward, a junior associate approached her with a question, and she gave a real answer, not a rehearsed one. I didn't say anything, but when she looked over at me, I gave her the smallest of nods. It wasn't forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. Daniel had no idea what his wedding had set in motion, and I was glad for that. He continued being his kind, steady self, oblivious to the undercurrents that had once threatened to pull everything apart. One evening, we sat on his balcony with takeout containers between us while Clara worked late. "Do you think people really change?" he asked suddenly, catching me mid-bite. I looked at him carefully, wondering where the question had come from. "I think they can," I said slowly, "but only if they want to, and only if they're willing to lose something first." He nodded, thoughtful, pushing noodles around his plate. "I think Clara's trying," he said. "She's softer with me, and she's different with her team now. Less about being right, more about being fair." I smiled gently and changed the subject, letting him hold his version of hope. He'd earned that much, and maybe Clara had too. By early spring, the firm announced a new initiative focused on ethical leadership, and they asked me to help design the program. It would be integrated into all onboarding, mentorship, and client engagement strategies, a permanent part of their foundation. I agreed under one condition, that the content not be tied to me personally. "It's not about branding," I told James. "It's about roots." He understood, and together we drafted modules that prioritized listening, community, and interdependence. Clara was assigned to help pilot the rollout, and she didn't flinch when she saw my name on the internal planning memo. "Let me know where you need me," she wrote in the comments section. I read the line twice, then typed, "I will." No fanfare, no performance, just 2 women doing the work. On my last day consulting with the firm, I brought donuts to the office, a small tradition I used to have during final exam weeks. People laughed, gathered in the break room, and someone even brought balloons. Clara came in just before lunch, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with blue string. "It's nothing big," she said, placing it on my desk. "Just a thank you." I opened it to find a silver bookmark engraved with the words, "May you always know your story matters." It was simple, elegant, and completely unexpected. "You didn't have to," I said. "I know," she replied, but I wanted to. Monday, the cat was printed on the corner of the card inside, drawn in delicate pencil strokes. Somehow, that meant more than anything. I placed the bookmark in the early draft of my manuscript that night, between 2 pages that talked about restraint and when silence is more powerful than speech. It felt like the right place for it, nestled in a chapter titled, "The Meek Aren't Weak." The book was nearly finished, 2 more chapters and a closing note, then off to edits. I had worried I wouldn't have enough to say, but now I found myself trimming rather than padding. Stories had poured out of me like they'd been waiting for permission. Not all of them were about Clara. In fact, most weren't, but the thread of that wedding day wove through them all. It wasn't the insult that defined the moment. It was what followed. The redefinition of power, the recalibration of self-respect, the quiet decision not to disappear. Clara had given me a terrible gift, and I'd used it to rebuild a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd let shrink. It no longer hurt to remember what she'd said that day, but I would never forget it, not because it cut deep, but because it revealed how much deeper I could go in response. Daniel invited me over for dinner the following week, saying Clara wanted to cook for once. "Don't laugh," he warned. "But she's really trying to learn." I smiled and brought a bottle of wine, half expecting takeout containers to be hidden in the oven. Instead, I found Clara in the kitchen, hair tied back, apron on, chopping herbs with precise, nervous concentration. "Just don't critique the knife skills," she said before I could speak, her voice light but not brittle. I offered to help, but she declined, adding, "I've watched 6 YouTube videos. I'm practically a chef now." Dinner was simple: roasted vegetables, salmon, and a lemon tart that leaned a little too hard on the zest, but it was one of the most sincere meals I'd ever been served. Clara didn't apologize for the burnt edges or the uneven crust. She laughed with us, ate with us, and asked questions that weren't filtered through social strategy. At one point, Monday jumped onto the dining bench and curled up beside me, her tail flicking across my knee like punctuation. This was not the woman who once used my silence to elevate herself. This was someone else entirely, not new, but uncovered. After dessert, Daniel left us in the kitchen while he took a call from a friend overseas. Clara rinsed dishes in the sink, and I dried them slowly, wondering if this was the moment she'd say something more. "Do you think we're still allowed to change?" she asked finally, her voice just loud enough to rise over the water. I turned to her, towel in hand. "Allowed?" I echoed. "Who would stop us?" She shrugged, setting a glass upside down on the rack. "I used to think reinvention was for failures. But now I think maybe it's what separates the arrogant from the brave." I smiled, because that was exactly the kind of sentence I would have circled in red and written yes next to in a student essay. "It's not about undoing who we were," I said gently. "It's about making room for who we might still become." She nodded, not as someone who agreed, but as someone who had already begun to understand. The book launched quietly 3 months later with a modest rollout. No book tours, no television appearances, just a handful of intimate events and podcast features. Still, it found its audience. The first week brought a surprising number of reviews, most from educators, nonprofit workers, and middle managers tired of loud leadership culture. One woman wrote, "This is the book I didn't know I needed. It reminded me that staying kind doesn't mean staying quiet." I didn't track the rankings, but James sent me an excited email when we made it onto a top 10 ethical reads list. Clara didn't mention the release directly, but she shared the book on her feed again, this time with a quote pulled from Chapter 6. "Control is a brittle currency. Compassion lasts longer." Her caption read, "Still learning." It got more likes than anything else she'd posted that year. Daniel called that night to say how proud he was, then joked about getting me to sign a copy. "Before the price goes up." I told him I'd sign one for Monday too, and he laughed until he hiccuped. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership summit. Not a flashy one, just a local event hosted by a regional nonprofit I'd volunteered with years ago. I almost declined, thinking it might be time to step back and let the next wave rise. But then I saw the list of attendees and noticed how many were fresh out of college, just stepping into careers where they'd be tested. So I said yes. I spoke without slides, without props, just me and a stool and a handheld mic that made my voice feel more grounded than amplified. I told them about my first classroom, my toughest student, the wedding, and the mistake that became a mirror. I spoke about how being underestimated isn't always an insult. Sometimes it's an invitation. Clara sat in the front row. She didn't fidget or check her phone. She watched me like a student who finally wanted to learn. Afterward, she waited until most people had left before approaching me, arms crossed but shoulders soft. "You were brilliant," she said. "Not polished, not rehearsed, just true." I thanked her, feeling the kind of warmth that doesn't need to be earned. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, her voice quieter now. "Back at the wedding, I knew what I was doing. I wasn't nervous or flustered. I said it on purpose. I didn't flinch, I just waited. I thought putting you down would lift me up," she continued. "But it didn't. It made me hollow." I exhaled, not relief or anger, just something final. "I know," I said. "That's why I didn't fight you. I let your words echo so you'd hear them too." In that moment, there was no battle left, no performance, no one keeping score. Clara looked at me, not as her opponent or even her in-law, but as someone she'd misjudged and now wanted to meet again for the first time. "If I ever become a mother," she said suddenly, "I hope I remember all of this. Every hard lesson, every ounce of grace you gave me when I didn't deserve it." I smiled and touched her arm lightly. "Motherhood isn't about perfection. It's about modeling recovery." She nodded, eyes glassy but proud, and then she hugged me. Not a quick, formal squeeze, but something slower. Something that made space for forgiveness to take its first full breath. Life didn't change overnight after that conversation, but it settled into something surprisingly gentle. Clara didn't become someone new. She became someone clearer, someone less hungry for recognition, and more curious about depth. She still worked hard, still led projects with a sharp mind and sharper instincts, but now she listened more. At one staff meeting, she corrected a junior associate, then immediately apologized when she realized she'd cut them off. James raised his eyebrows at me across the table, and I gave him a small, knowing smile. Daniel noticed too, and during one Sunday dinner he leaned over his plate and said, "She's different with people now. I don't know what you did, but it stuck." I told him I didn't do anything. She chose her own change. Monday, sprawled across the kitchen rug, flicked her tail as if to confirm that people were slow learners, but not hopeless. When I looked at Clara across the table that evening, she looked back without flinching, not as someone guarding her place, but as someone willing to share it. My book eventually made its way into classrooms, handed out by teachers who recognized something of themselves in its pages. One community college in the Midwest even made it required reading for their education majors. The editor sent me a box of letters one day, handwritten notes from students, all thanking me for reminding them that leadership doesn't have to be loud. I read them on my porch with a blanket over my knees, Monday curled like a comma beside me. Clara stopped by unannounced that afternoon, holding a pie she had not made and 2 mugs of cider. "I heard about the college thing," she said, handing me the cup. "That's pretty amazing," I nodded, handing her the top letter. A short message from a girl named Renee, who said she almost dropped out until she read Chapter 9. Clara read it in silence, then folded the paper with a kind of reverence that didn't need to be explained. "I wish someone had written me a letter like that when I was starting out," she said. "Maybe I would have hurt fewer people along the way." We didn't talk much after that, just sat in companionable quiet while the wind tugged at the trees. She told me about a project she was mentoring now, a quiet young analyst who reminded her of the version of herself she didn't like to remember. "She's sharp," Clara said, "but scared, so I'm trying to be who I needed at that age." I nodded, because that's the only way it works. We don't undo the harm. We dilute it with better actions moving forward. Clara had begun to live by that, not just say it. She still didn't call it redemption. She wasn't that sentimental, but she understood now that power wasn't about being right first. It was about creating space so others didn't have to be afraid to speak second. That day, she left the pie behind, and later that evening, I found a sticky note on the inside of the lid that read, "You taught me more than any MBA ever did." I kept it, pressed between the pages of my book draft, right beside the silver bookmark. The firm eventually offered me a permanent advisory position, and I declined it with gratitude. My time there had run its course, and I wanted the stage to belong to someone else now. James respected the decision, and in our final meeting he said, "You didn't just change this place, you changed how we think about what matters." I told him I hadn't changed anything, just reminded them what was already true. That people deserve to be seen before they're sorted and heard before they're corrected. Clara sent me a thank you email that same day, short and to the point, ending with, "I hope I can do this place justice." I replied, "You already are." Daniel, ever the peacemaker, never asked why I left. He just hugged me when I told him and said, "They were lucky to have you." He meant it, and I let myself believe it. Monday celebrated by dragging one of his socks behind the couch, like she too had reached a milestone. That winter, Clara and Daniel hosted their first holiday dinner together, and I was invited without hesitation, no politics, no caveats. Clara made the roast herself, successfully this time, and Daniel carved it with theatrical flair while Clara rolled her eyes affectionately. They'd grown into a rhythm that was believable now, less like a performance and more like a shared song. The apartment was cozy, with string lights in the window and a mismatched set of ornaments that Clara had let Daniel pick, even the glittery one shaped like a raccoon. Over dessert, Clara tapped her glass and said, "I have an announcement." Daniel looked at her like she was about to say they were moving to Peru, but she only smiled. "We're starting the adoption process," she said. "It'll take time, and we're early in it, but it's happening." I didn't cry, but I felt my breath catch, because this was a woman who once thought vulnerability was a weakness. Now she was opening her life to someone who hadn't even arrived yet. Later that evening, after Daniel had gone to find a playlist and Monday was pawing at a candy wrapper under the table, Clara sat beside me. "I know I'll make mistakes," she said, "but I'm not afraid of them anymore." I believed her. She had learned to sit with discomfort, to ask questions before offering answers, and to listen even when it cost her pride. "That child will be lucky," I said, "because they'll get a mother who had to learn how to become one." She laughed softly, wiping the corner of her eye. "I'm going to tell them about you, you know," she said. "Not just what you did, but what you didn't do. How you let me find the truth on my own." I reached over, gently squeezing her hand. "Then tell them the truth, that we met because of a mistake, but stayed because of a choice." That night, as I walked home through the cold, I thought about how life rarely hands us clean beginnings. It gives us jagged ones, torn edges, awkward silences, missteps we can't take back. But if we're lucky, and we're brave, we can stitch them into something softer. Clara had not been kind to me at first, but she'd chosen a harder road afterward. And that mattered more. The woman who once introduced me as an unemployed loser was now offering a home to a child who might one day feel like they didn't belong. And because of everything that had passed between us, she'd know how to show them they did. She would not be perfect, but she would be present. And sometimes that's what love looks like. Not the absence of failure, but the refusal to leave when things get hard. Spring arrived early the following year, ushered in by daffodils poking through the soil outside my kitchen window and the return of robins chirping their endless optimism. Monday had taken to watching them from her usual perch, tail twitching with restrained drama, though she never bothered to pounce. I had finished the second edition of The Quiet Seat at the Table by then. Just a few updates and a new afterword, written with more clarity and less caution. The afterword told the full story, including the wedding, Clara's public insult, and how what should have broken me became the blueprint for something stronger. I used real names only where permission had been given, and Clara had surprised me by saying, "Don't protect me, let it be honest." I kept it fair, told the truth without spite, and focused on what came after the fracture. That chapter was titled, "So I Just Stayed Standing." It was the only part of the book that made me cry while writing it. Not because it was painful, but because I knew, finally, that my voice didn't need volume to be valid, just intention, and the choice to use it. When the book launched in paperback, I hosted a small gathering at the local bookstore, the same place where I used to read to Daniel when he was small enough to sit still. Clara came early to help set up chairs, arranging them in neat rows and adjusting signs without being asked. She wore a navy blouse I recognized, the same one I'd worn to my first leadership talk. And when I complimented her on it, she said, "I remembered how strong you looked in it." I wanted to feel the same. It struck me then how far we'd come from that hotel ballroom, from the sharpness of her words and the flatness of her smile. Now her presence was warm, intentional, and almost reverent. During the reading, I chose a quiet section, not the dramatic reveal, but a passage about dignity in the face of dismissal. Clara sat in the front row, eyes shining, her fingers laced in her lap like she was holding something sacred. When I finished, the applause was soft but full, like a room exhaling. She stood up before anyone else and clapped the longest. That meant more to me than anything. After the event, a young woman approached me, tears in her eyes, holding a copy of the book to her chest like it contained medicine. "I was at a job where they treated me like I was invisible," she said. "Your words reminded me that I still matter." I hugged her. Not a quick, polite gesture, but a full embrace, because some things deserve to be met with more than gratitude. Clara stood nearby, watching quietly, and when the woman left, she said, "You didn't just write a book. You built a mirror." I thought of all the years I'd spent being told to shrink, to defer, to let others lead. And now, someone like Clara was calling me a builder, not of resumes or reputations, but of something deeper. That night, we walked to our cars side by side, no need to fill the silence with anything unnecessary. When we reached hers, she turned and said, "I used to think the wedding was the most important day of our lives." I waited, letting her finish. But I think maybe this was. 3 months later, Daniel called me with a catch in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy with scraped knees and big questions. "We got the call," he said, voice shaky. "The agency matched us with a baby girl. We're bringing her home in 2 weeks." I stood in the middle of my kitchen, hand on my chest, the world slowing just enough to let the words sink in. "Oh, Daniel," I whispered, "I'm so proud of you." He cried then, openly, without shame, and I cried with him. Later, Clara sent me a picture of the nursery. Pale green walls, shelves of children's books, and a framed print of a raccoon with glittery eyes. Monday sat curled on the crib mattress like she'd claimed it as her new throne. Beneath the photo, Clara's message read, "She'll know who you are before she knows what a lullaby is." When the baby arrived, they named her Elise, a name Clara had loved since childhood, but had never dared to imagine saying aloud. Elise was small, dark-haired, with a furrowed brow and eyes that looked like they'd already seen everything and decided to forgive it. The first time I held her, Clara watched me with the same expression she used to reserve for risk assessments. But this time, it was awe, not apprehension. "She already likes you more than me," she joked softly. I kissed Elise's forehead and said, "She just knows I come with snacks and stories." Daniel hovered nearby, giddy and overwhelmed, asking questions he already knew the answers to, just to feel anchored. It was strange, watching your child become a parent. It felt like watching time fold in on itself, a circle closing and opening all at once. Clara didn't hover. She paced. She memorized bottle schedules. She color-coded drawers. But when Elise cried, it was Clara who could calm her best. Not because of instinct, but because she'd earned it. Months passed, and Elise grew from fragile to fierce, babbling at Monday, pulling Daniel's hair, reaching for books before toys. Clara returned to work part-time, easing back into her old role with new softness, while Daniel took parental leave and discovered he could, in fact, change diapers without tragedy. They invited me to babysit on Thursdays, and I began to cherish those evenings. Bath time giggles, lullaby playlists, and tiny fingers curled around mine. Elise had no idea about the history between her mother and me, but sometimes I wondered if she could feel it, if some echo of forgiveness had made its way into her bones. One night, after Elise fell asleep, Clara sat beside me on the couch, her eyes tired but kind. "You changed the shape of our family," she said, not as a compliment, but a fact. "I don't know how to repay that." I shook my head. "You don't have to," I replied. "You raised a daughter who will never see her mother make power out of cruelty. That's enough." The final chapter of my second edition was titled, "Legacy is What You Leave in Other People's Hands." I wrote it in one sitting, the way some truths just come when they're ready, not when you chase them. I didn't name Elise, but I described her. the baby with the watchful eyes, the parents who had learned not how to lead, but how to listen. I closed the manuscript and placed the silver bookmark at the end. Then I sat back, sipping my tea, Monday snoring softly near the heater, and let the silence do what it always did best. Remind me that the loudest echoes come from the softest steps. I had started this story believing I'd been humiliated, reduced to a footnote at my own son's wedding. But that wasn't the ending. That was the invitation, and I'd accepted it. Not with vengeance, but with vision. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you leave, there's another story similar to the one you just watched. You'll see it on the top left of your screen.